Well, hello, my fellow Theosophical Lodge buddies and or guests. Let's see, my screen just glitched, but I'm hoping it looks okay for you. Um, it's good to see you all here again for one of these little Sunday night chats that we've been doing for a while now. And for now, I'm going to stick with the pattern I've been doing so far, which is to talk about some latest news and interesting developments in the field of consciousness science. That keeps going, keeps exploding, keeps surprising me. I think eventually I might start to branch these out and go into other realms of science, having to do with cosmology and quantum mechanics and other places where I have interests. But tonight we're going to stick with consciousness, and probably next time too. Um, so, since I saw you last, I attended a virtual conference in Tucson. It's called the Science of Consciousness Conference that they hold periodically every 2 years in Tucson, and it's just a wonderful kind of Disneyland of amazing stuff. I'm still processing that. That was about a month ago, or well, a little more than. I'm not really going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to go with some other material that I've come across even more recently, and then I think next time I'll cycle back and we'll take a dive into the Tucson conference and some of the more amazing lessons that I took from there. This will be a little bit more recent news kind of stuff from literature sources. So one of the there's a piece of news I've actually meant to weave into one of these talks for a while now, and I'm finally going to get around to it tonight because it's just such a bizarre and kind of beautiful finding in terms of the diversity and the different forms that complex behavior takes. One of the things I've mentioned a number of times is that we don't have a good definition of the word consciousness. It's different people from different disciplines apply different definitions, have different ideas. You could just generalize it to mean any kind of complex adaptive behavior. And so one of the things that's been known for a long time, in many different representations of, is that microorganisms are capable of very complex behavior. They swim towards things they like. They swim away from things they don't. They find each other under certain circumstances. Some microorganisms have sex. There's a lot of strange stuff going on in a drop of water. And so there's an organism here. Let's see, it's from a, I'm going to show the picture first. Forgive me while I take a while to get this in the plane of focus. That's the picture of it. I hope it's coming through to you at least somewhat. That's an example of a whole genus of protists called Euplotis. Protist is a word. It means something bigger and more complicated than a bacteria. So there's many different types and categories of microorganisms. Protists are kind of like the biggest and most animal-like. Some of them are even visible by eye. This little guy, I believe, is kind of visible by eye, just barely. This organism that I just showed you has 14 kind of big, weird, lanky legs that come out from it. And it was some workers at UC San Francisco who first noticed just how interesting this thing was. It was not that long ago. This report is coming from August 7th in 2021. And they noticed these things were like walking around on the slide, eating the organisms they were trying to study. So this is a predator, this organism. And it's got these big, weird 14 legs, kind of like a spider. And it has this kind of ungainly, weird gait, but that nonetheless moves it along, gets it where it wants to go. It chases down and eats other bugs, and seems to have a fair amount of directional volition and kind of knows what it's doing. So the scientists at UCSF got interested in, well, how's it doing this? How does an organism with no nervous system coordinate the functioning of 14 legs to walk along a surface in pursuit of something it wants to eat that's moving and trying to get away? And interestingly, what they came upon was that just inside the body of this thing, near the area where the legs insert, they would find a bundle of a certain kind of neuronal organelle called a microtubule. It's probably not an organelle. We just call it a structural element. These microtubules are much talked about in science of consciousness these days. Well, these microtubules at the base of the legs of this bug seem to be operating in the fashion of an analog computer. They're hooked up inside, they're talking back and forth to each other in a mechanical fashion, and they're acting according to the mathematics, at least, of something called a finite state machine, which means, I'm guessing, that means only a certain number of possible combinations of positions, and the legs click between these different possible positions according to communicated commands coming from this internal cytoskeleton of microtubule connecting rods and levers of some kind. That's as best as I can make out from this article, which is a synopsis, obviously. I have not yet gone to the original source literature to try to suss this out. I'm going off of a fairly crisp and abbreviated description. But it's a fascinating development, and of course, these scientists are hoping that this will turn out to be a relatively general observation. They did discover that they can, well, I'm not sure they quite completely stopped, but they can very much interfere with the motility of these bugs if they give drugs that interfere with the operation and assembly of microtubules. So that's a big hint as far as what's going on in this. Yeah, keep an eye on that. We might be learning about analog computational brains inside of microorganisms in different formats coming up over a period of time here. We'll find out. Now, the word microtubule you've heard me mention before. It turns out that they're ubiquitous. They're in all complex cells. They are quite prevalent in the axons of neurons. And one of the leading researchers in consciousness research is a guy named Stuart Hameroff, and along with Roger Penrose some years ago, they came up with an idea having to do with actually the components of these tubulin microtubules. They're made from what are called tubulin dimers in a certain spiral form stack. And they came up with an idea that there might be quantum computation happening in the tubulin dimers that form along this long microtubule structure in neurons that are helping neurons decide when to fire or not according to the combinatorial rules of quantum mechanics. That was much talked about at the Tucson conference. There is a recent issue of the New Scientist. Let's see, this is the April 23rd, and they came out with a summary after that conference, which I read in some detail and have a bunch of questions about and some objections to. I'm going to hold up this picture here so you might be able to see what a kind of a stained and amplified graphic of the microtubules look like. So this is a small collection of cells. The yellow lines, if you can resolve them in this picture, are the microtubules in that assemblage of cells. So a number of experiments have been done wherein they cool assemblages of microtubules down to low temperatures, then bombard them with light of different wavelengths and observe the fluorescence that comes off. And in some cases they can detect rather mysterious and very interesting photophysical effects of delayed luminescence coming off of these assemblages, sometimes for hundreds of milliseconds. And that is scientifically surprising and interesting. I'm still put me in the skeptic category as to whether it's called orchestrated objective reduction, OR, is the model whereby they're hypothesizing that computations done at a quantum level inside of neurons are what gives rise to the computational richness necessary for cognition to happen. And this is very much an idea that Roger Penrose, who's a brilliant Nobel laureate physicist, came to this as he was thinking in the 90s about what must necessarily underlie the phenomenon of cognition and subjective awareness. And so it's a very alive topic, and I think what I'm going to do is come back to this with a little bit more detail and some better graphics next time, and give you some strengths and weaknesses, and try to explain in detail why I'm not convinced, and why it's important, I think, to know what has been proven or not, because this is such a beautiful idea, the quantum computational stuff. That's what gives rise to consciousness, that it attracts lots of believers. And the believers aren't necessarily reading the literature with a critical eye, whereas I do. And that'll figure brightly next time. Next idea I wanted to get to here with you folks was an article that popped in almost the most recent issue of Scientific American. A really beautiful article. It's called How the Brain Builds Reality. And this is the issue of the thing. And this particular article, How the Brain Builds Reality, is, I've realized, was sort of like a review article and a testimony of life's work on the part of a very well-known and highly accomplished neuroscientist named Georgi Bousaki. And he has been working in the front lines of neuroscience and going off of a particular paradigm of how cognition happens and what the trains of events are within that set of modeling and ideas. And what had existed up until recently was a model that he termed it the outside-in model of perception and cognition, meaning that you can look upon the brain and the collection of neurons in a newborn baby or what have you as a sort of a disorganized blank slate or tabula rasa, untrained, uninformed bunch of connections. But then over time, as inputs come in through the sensory apparatus and eyes, ears, what have you, the brain starts building up associations and learning to couple exterior events with interior states, and slowly a clue begins to happen, and meaning begins to attach to certain input stimuli. Well, Dr. Bousaki, he was working with rats for like the last 30-ish years and doing single neuron recordings and small groups of neuron recordings as they have rats perceive, learn, remember, commit to action, navigate mazes, large number of tasks in a very active and large research lab. And they were able to slowly but look at the patterns of activity and correlations that they came up with and just realize that's just wrong. And he's made a very good case in this Scientific American paper for letting go of that model and replacing it with a whole new model that they're referring to as the inside-out model of cognition, learning, and memory. And I'm going to have to condense this down pretty drastically here. It's a very long, involved article. It took me a while to read it, and I read it twice. There's a lot in it, but if I just kind of give you the quick summary version of it, it would be that we are born and just innately have about 20% of our neuronal architecture very strongly wired. And he has a name for this. He calls it the rich club of neurons. And they are not very plastic. In other words, their connections are not in some state of flux. They're continuing to be alert, active, ready to go at all times, even under disengaged brain states. This leads me to wonder if they might be part of what's called the default mode network of the brain. You didn't mention that one way or the other in this article, but it might be. Anyway, the point being, the inside-out model of learning, cognition, development thereof, is referring to the fact that this set of neurons is looking for something to do. And it's always ready to initiate action. It seems to be the set of neurons that prompts decisions to act and then directions of action into the external world. And it is, he thinks, and his models support, and it is gaining general agreement as far as I can tell from the references he gives in this paper, that what is happening is that we refine our instantiation in the world and develop our cognition, our ideas of how it works, learn to ascribe meaning very substantially by having this 20% of hardwired, kind of always ready to go neurons launching actions, and then detecting and making sense of what comes back from the world. And then the other 80% of our neuronal population, which is slower acting, less connected, but more plastic, meaning the connections are much more changeable, begin to form and morph around that and somehow attach meaning and values and assessments of outcomes to the actions that were launched. And that actually does make quite a bit of sense if you stop and think about it. You stop and think about how an infant learns, particularly, say, language, but even just moving, navigating, acting on, manipulating, interfacing with the world. There is this incessant trial and error, action, observe, refine, repeat loop going on. And that seems to be the new paradigm, the new model that is taking hold in this particular field of neuroscientific research, which is confined to these kind of neuron recordings in animals as they're executing tasks and such. And then, of course, it gets generalized out into broader ways of measuring and interfacing. So that's in the process of happening now. Broader ways of assessing brain activity. I'm going to get to that. So I found that to be just an extremely interesting and sort of a portentous article. And he went on in this case to talk a little bit about the implications for artificial intelligence research. Because one of the things they've discovered was that for many years, up till recently, people trying to build artificial intelligence were constructing their circuitry and their software around the idea of outside-in type of causality chains, because that's how they've been used to thinking about it in the lab, doing work with actual living organisms. But problems arise. One of them being that at a certain point along the way of a neural network training itself according to an outside-in architecture, kind of a catastrophic event would happen. I think it was called catastrophic interference, wherein the neural network would erase itself and kind of start over and never really get to full fruition. And so threaded here and there throughout this article are pieces of information and promises, indications that by retuning the idea of how cognition works and develops, we're going to be in a better position to design AI systems that will work better. And so that's, put a bookmark in that. That's very interesting. It might mean that we'll see in the next 10 years a quantum leap in the quality of artificial intelligence systems by designing them to better mimic what is now coming clear about biological ones. Okay, so then last one I was going to go over with you here this evening that actually I found sort of the most interesting and inspiring of all of them. This is coming from the May 7th issue of my old favorite science magazine here. Well, there's no picture on the front of this one, but the article is about a particularly insightful, a technically challenging and technically very important study done by some people at Cambridge, wherein they combined two types of brain imaging or brain monitoring technology into a single experiment. That's always important to do. I mean, in my own research work as a scientist, as a physical chemist in the lab, I would go way out of my way to try to do that. Have some phenomenon I'm interested in. I'm used to studying it with technique X. I'm really good at technique X. I think I know all about it. But if I could learn about technique Y and bring it to bear on the very same phenomena, there's a really good chance I'm going to learn something new and maybe catch myself in an error. Well, what these folks have done is they've combined the two brain techniques you may have heard of called Fmri. Fmri stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. And you've seen these beautiful pictures where they'll show a brain of somebody in a scanner and ask them to perform a task, or where do they leave their keys, some question that will cause them to have to rifle through memory, come up with an answer, formulate it, hold it in mind, perhaps answer it verbally. And they can trace kind of slowly and approximately where in the brain metabolism happens. The reason has to do with the nature of the signal. The fMRI signal comes from something actually called the BOLD signal, blood oxygen level detection. Because when brain tissue goes active in response to demand for a task, the metabolism in that area kicks up, and that changes the oxygen level in the blood, and that's what gets imaged. So the spatial resolution is okay. It's down to a couple millimeters in a good scanner. The temporal resolution, meaning the fineness with which events can be watched in time, is not so great because it's a lagging signal. The bold signal takes half a second or so to really become very visible. So in a sense, what you're looking at in an fMRI brain scan of somebody doing something is a historical, lagging picture of what took place. Now, you can tell pretty well where it took place. You can tell what happened before what else, but it's fuzzy. So much better than that for time resolution of what's going on is what we call EEG. That's electroencephalographic reading. And those are the ones where you may have seen in TV shows or videos you've watched, where there'll be like a helmet on somebody's head that's got like a bunch of little things in it, little dots, little electrodes, and then sometimes wires coming off of those. So you see somebody like with a helmet and a bunch of wires coming off in a big coronal to-do. They're not always like that. Sometimes now it's wireless. But anyway, what they're doing is recording electrical activity from as many points on the scalp as they can afford to do. 256 is considered pretty good at this moment in time. And the nice thing about that is that it's fast. It studies things on the time scales of milliseconds, and you can follow oscillations and spiking of neurons, brain waves, whatever those are, that's a whole other topic we could go into. But patterns of electrical activity as they spread over the scalp, presumably reflecting what's happening underneath in the brain. And there's a lot of research validating that that's generally a good assumption. So this brilliant study used the fMRI, where is stuff happening, with coupled EEG, exactly when is it happening. And they were able to pull out new levels of information about a brain circuit or neuronal circuit that was not known to be there before. And it's so interesting because it offers hope. This is a thing that, if it pans out, it could end up being a key insight to helping address many layers of human suffering. And so here's the experiment that they did, and to make sense of this. They took a bunch of volunteers and trained them with, I don't know the exact how long they did this or what the paradigm was, but trained them to associate 12 pairs of words, these study subjects. And I think 48 people in this. That's not a big number, but it's better than 6. What they then did was they put them in the MRI scanner with the helmet on, and they trained them in another add-on, which is, okay, we're going to give you word number 1 that you have paired a word number 2 to go with. But when we give you word number 1, we're going to flash for you either a green light, a red light, or a white light. And with the green light, go ahead and remember word number 2. And I guess they asked them to then report it after some delay. But if we give you a red light, don't remember word number 2. If you get a white light, just hang out and don't sweat it. And so they would study what was going on inside these people's heads when they would get word number 1 and then one of these stimuluses, either green, red, or white. So go, don't go, or don't worry about it. And then watch the pattern of events that would take place in their brain and test how good their recall was of word number 2. And what was so fascinating about this is that they discovered that there was a circuit in the brain that seemed to be acting like a bad thought alert. So what has happened is that they've trained these people to associate red with, no, don't remember that. And what would happen after about 350 milliseconds, there was a certain brain center that is associated with attention and volition. That center is called the Dorsal Anterior Cingulate Cortex. I wish I knew my brain anatomy well enough to point for you on my head exactly where that was, but to say dorsal anterior, I'm guessing it's somewhere up there. A signal would arise there after about 350 milliseconds, which would then be propagated to the memory area, or one of the memory areas. This is a slightly complicated topic, but one of the validated memory areas called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And in fact, that signal, never observed before, the strength of it would predict how good of a job these people did at suppressing their memory of word number 2. So some people seem to have especially good ability to suppress a memory just innately. Some didn't. It happens in 350 milliseconds. That's interesting because actually one of the things that's pretty well known is that you cannot form an associated memory in less than 500. So it takes about 500 milliseconds. That's a half a second to consciously pair this with that, two things that you've learned to associate. Now, there are contexts where it can happen faster than that, having to do with bodily emotions and muscle memory and such, but just as general cognitive working memory, it's about a half a second long process. And yet, these people were sending a don't remember signal from one part of their brain to the other in 350 milliseconds. That means that this is happening subconsciously. This is happening below the level of conscious thought. But nonetheless, they're able to do it. They're able to internalize the training and execute it in a way that shows up in the data, purportedly robustly. I will look forward to seeing if this reproduces. Lots of science doesn't. I mean, that's a whole other topic I could go into. Biomedical research like this can be very difficult to reproduce. So I'll get more excited about this after I hear that it has been reproduced. But it's so promising because what it stands to do is if people can train in this, how many people do we know who suffer from PTSD, OCD, anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts? That just threads all through so many different types of mental illness, and some of them debilitating, some of them flatten and rob people of parts of their awareness and joy in life. Some people are just rendered non-functional by intrusive thoughts and unwanted cognitive patterns that come back unbidden. So, wow, that one is really huge. And we're living in a time in history when there's a lot of suffering out there. PTSD happens everywhere, and it's happening some places an extra amount these days. And so that one really might make a big difference. It's worth keeping one's eyes on it. And if I run across validation of this over the next year or two, maybe I'll try to bring it to the group's attention and make note of it, since you've now been sensitized to it. All right. I think that's almost 36 minutes. So I'm going to call it a night for now. And next time we're going to go a little bit more into the details of the OR quantum computation debate, call it a controversy, and some nuggets from the Tucson conference that happened there a few weeks ago. Thank you very much. I hope you folks all have a great week. Jeff out.